Kevin introduced Tyler Dawn as the chair of the board of directors of the new alliance, and doubts about the financial backing of the organization disappeared. Almost all of Chicago's elites leapt at the opportunity to join such a formidable business conglomerate. However, a handful of people in the back of the room were clearly expressing some hesitation. Kevin called them out and walked slowly to the back of the room where they were gathered, as he told them coldly that they might as well take their business elsewhere and get out of Chicago. Most of the time in life, those who don't have money and power have to bite their tongues in public when they're humiliated. That was certainly the case at tonight's banquet. It was only at this moment that everyone realized Kevin's true purpose. In a thinly veiled way, he was clearly intent on eliminating any form of dissent. In the end, he was going to eliminate all those who were not on the same side as him. Together with Dalton Steele, Emo Squire, Adriana Wright, and the others, there was also Tyler Dawn, of course, who had an extraordinary amount of power that he wielded over the entire country. Such a lineup was not something these few holdouts could easily withstand. Their faces became as white as sheets as they exchanged nervous glances, but they could only clench their fists and swallow their words. "Miss Wright, you can arrange things for these few people. If they still want to stay in Chicago, you know what to do," Kevin said as he put down the empty wine glass, turned around, and spoke slowly to Adriana Wright. "Yes, sir," Adriana Wright said with a nod, knowing what to do. The two of them simply exchanged a few words, thereby deciding the fate of a handful of extremely wealthy individuals who had roots in Chicago stretching back many years. Before the banquet ended, Kevin left the Salix Leaf Hotel with Dalton. With what they had set out to accomplish already put in motion, Kevin had no interest in staying any longer. He had always felt that this kind of socializing was tiresome. "What kind of plans do you have after this?" Kevin asked Dalton as they wandered aimlessly out onto the street. The cold wind in the night blew across their faces.
"What plans could I have? We have to take things one step at a time, don't we?"
Dalton said as he smiled coyly. "How about we go for a little walk?" Kevin said as he felt the brisk air give him new energy.
"All right, I know what you mean. You have the final say. This is your city, after all. But I'll have you know that I will definitely open up a bigger market in the future. Tell me, where do you want to go?"
Dalton replied casually as he kicked a can that was lying on the sidewalk. Kevin was not in a hurry to answer Dalton's question. He looked at the lights in the skyscrapers as they twinkled in the night sky, and he paused as if he was debating about whether he should tell Dalton what was really on his mind. In the Myriads camp, a huge map was hung on the wall. It was densely marked with countless red and white dots. Brett Stewart sat in a large armchair, and in front of him stood many high-ranking officials of the Myriads. The difference was that not only did they sit very still, but they also looked much more serious than he did. Brett Stewart's mere presence in the room seemed to cause the temperature to drop by several degrees.
"Is there any movement from the Alliance?"
Brett asked as he used his hands to support his chin, as his index finger slowly moved up to the bridge of his nose.
"Sir, according to the news sent back by our spies, the Alliance has gathered a significant army as of yesterday," one of the people in front of him answered. "How are the preparations for our equipment and pills going?"
Brett Stewart asked. His expression didn't change at all, as if he didn't put any stake in the size of the Alliance's forces. At this point, one would be hard-pressed to find anyone who had not heard that the Alliance and the Myriads, which each had such a long and storied history, were prepared to go to battle against one another. Everyone's attention was focused on the two major organizations. Until now, no one had stood up for either of them. However, everyone knew very well that they were all just waiting for the right opportunity, waiting for the end of the battle. Once the balance of victory and defeat was official, there would be a tremendous change in the landscape, and it was very likely that there would be a major reshuffling. After Brett Stewart asked the question about the Myriad's equipment and pills, he didn't receive an answer after a few seconds, causing his brows to tightly furrow.
"Could it be that something went wrong?"
he asked, his tone instantly dropping a few levels. This was the first time he had led such a large force into battle. Everyone knew that this situation was truly a matter of life and death. Brett Stewart and everyone else present knew that any problems at this point could have grave consequences. Hearing this, the higher-ups of the Myriads trembled slightly. They didn't even dare to breathe too loudly.
Sir, you have to understand, it's difficult to transport supplies to the battlefield. The environment here is very harsh,
one of the men said as he stood up. The man's voice became softer and softer as he spoke, and his lowered head was covered in cold sweat. The expressions of the other higher-ups also became somewhat ugly. Everyone could feel just how intense Brett Stewart's fury was. Suddenly, a cracking sound rang out in the tent. The armrest of the ornate chair that Brett Stewart was sitting in was forcefully crushed under his grip.
We're about to go to war. Do you have any idea how important those pills are to us? Don't you know what we're up against here?
Brett said as his voice became extremely cold and his eyes seemed to be flickering with a cold light. It was as if he was going to freeze someone with his gaze. No one dared to stand up and say anything else. The posturing between the two armies was ever changing, but everyone knew that the pills were extremely precious. It was almost a matter of life and death for both the Alliance and the Myriads. It was not an exaggeration to say that the chief herbalist was the most important person for both armies.
The top priority right now is to find a master herbalist, someone said, having finally mustered up the courage to step forward.
Brett Stewart stared coldly at everyone in the tent. He suddenly swept everything on the table onto the ground.
Now you know the importance of a chief herbalist? Then what were you thinking before? Do you think it's so easy to find a truly gifted herbalist? We need pills and we need formula so we can stay on our toes during the battle. Don't you understand? He shouted.
Everyone fell silent, just like what Brett Stewart had said. What they needed more than anything else was an herbalist with access to both pills and formulas. In war, an innovative pill formula was worth more than thousands of soldiers. At that moment, someone suddenly thought of something. A man hurriedly stood up and stepped before Brett Stewart, then said,
Sir, I have thought of a talented herbalist.
Who is it? Brett Stewart replied angrily. He was not in the mood to beat around the bush with them.
I heard that the Herbalist Society once held a competition that encompassed the entire Midwest region. A champion was crowned, the man said quietly.
Although he looked calm, in fact, he was panicking inside as he spoke. As expected, when it came to Kevin, the furious Brett Stewart instantly stopped. He was in deep thought and no one dared to disturb him. After a long time, he let out a long sigh.
I will pass along my orders soon. Keep our forces on high alert. Keep an eye on the Alliance at all times, he finally said.
Yes, sir,
everyone replied in unison. Brett Stewart waved his hand gently and everyone immediately stood up and left. Soon he was the only one left in the large tent. The burning flame of the candle on the table in front of him was flickering in the breeze of the night. Brett gently rubbed his forehead. He had been thinking long and hard, but he could not bring himself to make the final decision. Suddenly, a black shadow came in from the entrance of the tent like a ghost. Before he could be seen, he had already arrived beside Brett Stewart.
Can't make up your mind?
This person got straight to the point.
I owe Kevin a lot. It will be hard to predict life and death when these two armies meet on the battlefield. He still has so much to live for, and he has his family. I really don't want him. Ugh,
Brett Stewart started to say. He did not even finish his sentence. In the end, he could only put his head in his hands and let out a long sigh.
But at this point, you know that his herbalism skills are far greater than anyone else you could possibly find. Currently, all the pill formulas are basically in the hands of the Herbalist Society. He may be your only hope.
The man said softly as he placed his hand on Brett Stewart's shoulder.
But Kevin, Brett began to refute. No buts, the person interrupted. Not only do you want to rule the world, but you also don't seem to be willing to do what is necessary. You can't only consider Kevin's life, but also the lives of countless others. It's hard to predict the human heart. If you can hold it firmly in your hands, and if you let it go, won't you become a general without an army?
The person spoke in a long and plain tone. Brett Stewart frowned slightly, and a few rays of light seemed to flash in his eyes. His breathing unknowingly became more rapid. Suddenly, Brett slammed the table hard with both of his fists. The bodyguard outside the tent immediately ran in, but the person who had been standing beside Brett Stewart seemed to disappear out the back of the tent a split second before the curtain was lifted.
"Sir, is everything all right?" the bodyguard asked as he looked vigilantly at every corner of the tent. He was holding a weapon vigilantly in his hands. "Pass down my order. We need someone to go to Chicago immediately," Brett Stewart said in a serious tone. Things had already come to this point, and Brett Stewart had no choice but to do what he had been told. He knew that man was right. He had to take responsibility for the lives of countless people, and not just Kevin alone. At most, after the war was over, he would personally apologize to Kevin or to his family. If anything happened to Kevin, Brett was committed to taking care of his family as if they were his own. But Brett knew that the guilt of leading Kevin to any harm would probably crush him as well. Brett Stewart worried that his troops would be at a disadvantage without a stockpile of pills for the battle against the Alliance. It was suggested that Brett recruit Kevin to serve as the Army's herbalist, but secretly Brett worried for Kevin's safety. Then a mysterious figure appeared before Brett in the tent, urging him to call on Kevin because despite the immense risk it would pose to his own life, it was important that Brett considered the countless other lives that would be saved due to his presence. Brett finally relented and ordered one of his subordinates to go to Chicago right away. Meanwhile, on a mountain road near a lake a few hours north of Chicago, Kevin and Dalton each held a bottle of wine that they had been gulping all evening. The sea breeze blew over the two of them. The early winter weather brought along a bit of coldness in the wind. The two men stood atop an old wooden fence on the side of the road and let out a hysterical roar as if they wanted to vent all the dissatisfaction in their hearts. Everything they had been through over the years had accumulated in their hearts, one on top of another. It was as if invisible shackles had been placed on their bodies, but as long as they found a way to vent it out once in a while like wild beasts, they could still endure. Kevin was always unique. He was born a young heir to a rich family, but then he was expelled by his family. He fell into poverty and became a nobody only to rise again. In a short span, it was enough to say that he had already experienced the ups and downs of someone else's entire life. The amount of resentment and depression in his heart could not be compared to that of any ordinary person. In fact, sometimes Kevin also thought about just how different his life would be now if he did not choose to buy those stocks in the first place, or if he had not stumbled upon those two strange books. But look at what his life had become now. If things had been just slightly different, would he still be living a comfortable, relatively normal life at the Williams family mansion in New York? Or if things had broken another way, would he still be that nobody living under Dorothy's roof? He found it funny how a seemingly insignificant decision here or a lucky break there could change the course of his entire life so drastically. "Haha, Dalton, don't you think life is funny?" Kevin said suddenly. He looked like he was laughing on the surface, but his eyes were watery. "I was willing to be their dog, but they wouldn't let me. Instead, they forced me to become a wolf. Why didn't they just let me be?" he said, slurring his words slightly. Dalton drank another big mouthful of wine. He gazed into the distance at the pitch-black water as if it was endless darkness, making one unable to see any light of hope. Dalton said,
"Actually, I don't really understand what happened to you. To be honest, before I met you, although my life wasn't bad, and I have been fighting and killing every day to protect my family, I never felt like anyone could understand the bitterness in my heart. And I don't want to play with knives and guns all day either. Do you know what I mean? Even though it can be nice that so many people are afraid of me, why should I need them to be afraid of me? Is that really what I should be striving for? I also want to have a few friends who know who I really am. Living this way, do you have the feeling that everyone in your family needs to be kept under lock and key day and night? Even if you go out to the supermarket, you have to worry about whether something will happen to your family.
Dalton fiercely drank from the wine bottle. The alcohol was making him say things that had been in his heart for years, but he was too afraid to acknowledge. He swallowed and then added,
"But I don't have a choice. The Steele family goes back generations. It's not that easy to just walk away from this life, you know."
Kevin had grown tired of standing. He hopped down off the wooden fence and sat on the ground, quietly listening to Dalton's narration. However, as Dalton was rambling on, Kevin suddenly stood up and reached out, covering his mouth. Then he pulled him into the woods, disappearing in a flash. After a few seconds, 5 or 6 figures appeared on the side of the road not too far from where they had just been.
"Where are they? They were just here a second ago,"
the leader said in a low voice. "They couldn't have gotten far so quickly. They must still be nearby," another one of them immediately replied.
"Fan out and search,"
the leader said as he waved his hand and led his men toward the depths of the darkness. When they had disappeared from sight, Kevin, who was hiding by a tree, narrowed his eyes. Because the moonlight was too dim, he could not see their faces clearly.
"Kevin,"
Dalton said softly as he lowered his voice and looked around vigilantly.
"Who are those people?"
"I don't know yet," Kevin replied as he touched the tip of his nose and kept thinking. The Union or the Morris family? Or someone from the Herbalist Society? Kevin really couldn't figure out which force the men might belong to. But no matter who it was obvious that someone who had eyes but failed to see had come looking for trouble with him. "We can't stay here for long. Let's get out of here," Kevin said seriously. But before they could do anything, Kevin's phone suddenly rang. It was Rachel. Kevin originally wanted to reject the incoming call right away, but then he remembered that Rachel had been staying with Lily in Chicago these past few days. He could not help but have a bad feeling in his heart, so he picked up the phone. "Hello? Something happened, Kevin," Rachel quickly said before Kevin even had a chance to say anything. "I just arrived at the Salix Leaf Complex, but I don't see Lily or Dorothy anywhere. It looked like they left in a hurry because the stove was still on and some water had completely boiled over. I immediately went to the property management service to check the surveillance. About half an hour ago, someone barged into the apartment. Then he left with 2 large boxes." "Wait for me there. I'm on my way," Kevin said. He frowned and patted Dalton on the shoulder as he ended the call. "Dalton, come with me," he said. Soon, they arrived back at the Salix Leaf Complex in Chicago. Rachel was standing at the door when they got there, looking around anxiously. As soon as he entered the apartment, Kevin saw traces of a struggle. The coffee table was turned over and the floor was covered with fragments of coffee mugs, and a few strands of long hair were visible on the white floor tile, which was particularly worrisome. But what made Kevin the most worried was that there were traces of blood on the floor. Kevin could not help but clench his fist tightly. It felt as though the temperature in the room had suddenly dropped sharply. "Have you sent for someone to investigate? Do you have any idea yet who did it?" Kevin gritted his teeth and said slowly. When Kevin was in a state like this, Rachel and even Dalton shivered with a sort of dread and fear. I have already sent people to investigate, but they don't have any information yet." Rachel unconsciously stuttered as she spoke. She felt as if she was not even talking to Kevin at this moment, but rather a vicious beast intent on doing whatever it took to protect his wife. Kevin quickly took out his phone and called Spencer. Originally, he had arranged for people from the Radiants to stay at the Salix Leaf Complex and secretly protect Lily. But later, once things between him and Jake Morris had calmed down, he thought that she would be safe, so he withdrew the Radiant's forces. Spencer answered and Kevin immediately said, "Something has happened to my wife. Immediately bring some people here to Chicago to find her. Even if you have to burn the whole city to the ground, you have to find her for me. Remember, if you find the person responsible for this, don't kill him. Bring him to me alive. I'm going to kill him with my own bare hands." Kevin spoke more fiercely than Dalton or Rachel had ever heard him.
"Understood.
Without any further questions, Spencer immediately agreed and ended the call. A few minutes passed in the blink of an eye. After Kevin issued his order, the entirety of Chicago began to stir. Everyone secretly thought that Kevin was a complete lunatic. He seemed to go crazy again every few days. Dalton looked around and seemed to have thought of something. He looked at Kevin and then turned to Rachel and asked,
Rachel, do you know when the banquet organized by Kevin ended?
It seems as though it was about 12 hours ago. Rachel thought for a moment and then answered,
Kevin!
Dalton nodded and patted Kevin's shoulder to remind him to calm down. Now was not the time to be angry. It was important to remain focused. With Dalton's reminder, Kevin's anxious mood slowly recovered. He immediately called Adriana Wright. Because the plan Kevin had set in motion was so big, the follow-up work that needed to be carried out by Adriana Wright, Emo Squire, and Gilbert Rhodes, it kept them extremely busy all night. What is it, Kevin? Adriana Wright's busy yet respectful voice came from the other end of the phone as she answered Kevin's call. After the banquet ended, did the 4 people who were asked to leave Chicago do anything unusual? Kevin asked straightforwardly. Adriana was not a fool. She instantly saw the purpose behind Kevin's sudden call. It was obvious that something had happened. What happened? Although Adriana Wright had a guess in her mind, she did not ask it directly. My wife was taken by someone. Now I suspect that it was one of those few people at the banquet who took her, Kevin said concisely. Make a list of their addresses and then send it to my email. After finishing his instructions, Kevin hung up the phone. He walked to the sofa and sat down. He looked at the hair and blood on the ground and gradually began to lose his mind, punching the pillow beside him forcefully again and again. Dalton and Rachel looked at each other. They did not know what to say to comfort Kevin. If they tried to tell him not to worry, they knew how naive they would sound. After all, from a certain point of view, they were all business people. In the business world, deception was rampant. For the sake of their own interest, some people who were blinded by greed would be willing to do anything. Lily! Kevin shouted. His hands were tightly clasped together, supporting his chin. In his mind, he kept thinking about what Lily had said to him the last time he saw her. Adriana Wright was very efficient. In less than 2 minutes, she had sent the list over to him. Kevin looked at the screen of his phone coldly and slowly read out the names on it one by one.
Tony Sorrento? I've heard of him.
Dalton interrupted him when he heard one of the names.
That kid is in the building material business. He has a lot of connections in the city. He also acts pretty brazenly from time to time, relying on nepotism. There have been rumors that some of his adversaries even disappeared under mysterious circumstances.
Dalton Steele licked his lips. After hesitating for a moment, he continued to speak.
I'm sorry, I don't want to make you unnecessarily anxious. I'm just telling you the truth. If Sorrento really did it, Lily could be in great danger. She might even...
Dalton did not finish his sentence, but everyone understood exactly what he was going to say if he had. After learning that Lily had been kidnapped again, Kevin asked Adriana Wright to compile a list of everyone who had resisted joining his business alliance at the banquet the previous evening. As the names of the people were read off one by one, Dalton interjected when Tony Sorrento's name was read aloud. Dalton explained that he had heard some unsavory rumors about the way he dealt with business rivals in the past, and that if he was the man responsible, Lily could be in serious danger. Kevin squinted his eyes and took a deep breath. Let's go see Tony Sorrento first then, he said. It was already the morning of the next day. Kevin drove Dalton and Rachel to the front gate of an old villa. The 2 street lamps on the street in front of the house gave off a faint yellow light. Although the Sorrento family was not as wealthy and powerful as the likes of Adriana Wright and Mitchell Cook, they were still pretty well known throughout Chicago. The wide wooden door of the house was tightly shut. Kevin did not say a word and immediately pushed it open. A huge sound was heard throughout the villa, and even the windows began to tremble.
Several members of the Sorrento family quickly got out of bed in a rage, rushing downstairs to the foyer. "Mr. Williams?" Tony Sorrento, who was the first one to appear at the top of the stairs in a set of dark pajamas, had a shocked and angry expression on his face, which quickly turned to one of extreme anxiety when he saw Kevin standing there. He quickly recovered and put on a fake smile and said, "What are you doing here in the middle of the night? Can I help you with something? You could have called and I—" Kevin immediately interrupted him, growing coldly. "Tony Sorrento, how dare you attack my wife? Do you have a death wish or what?" If he wasn't worried about Lily's safety, he would have killed him, but then he wouldn't be as easy to talk to as he was now. "You really came here because of this?" Tony said as his voice stagnated and a trace of panic flashed across his eyes. "Hand her over if you know what's good for you. If not," Kevin began to say.
"If not what? What are you going to do?"
A man who looked about the same age as Kevin walked out and forcefully interrupted Kevin in the middle of a sentence. He yawned and glanced at Kevin.
"Kid, I've heard of you. Don't think that you've turned over some kind of new leaf. You have become a great and powerful figure, haven't you? But deep down you're still nothing."
Hearing this, Tony Sorrento closed his eyes without saying a word. If it weren't for the fact that this man was his only son, he would have ordered his men to drag him away and chop him up into pieces a long time ago.
"This kid is Tony Sorrento's son. He is as ambitious as he is greedy. He's just a rich punk who likes to drink and party. He's no one to worry about,"
Dalton said softly in Kevin's ear as he eyed the young man. After all, he had been in Chicago for so many years. He knew all the people who had made a name for themselves in the city, or who were trying to make a name for themselves at least. "Come here," Kevin said as he nodded his head and crooked his finger in the direction of the young man. "Mr. Williams," Tony Sorrento said in a panic. He heard that Kevin was very powerful and that his hand-to-hand combat skills were beyond anyone's imagination. Jason was Tony Sorrento's only son, and Tony knew that if he challenged Kevin, the fight would be a one-sided mismatch. "Come here," Kevin repeated himself more loudly, not paying any attention to Tony. "Don't move, Jason," Tony panicked. He grabbed the knife from one of the men beside him and made a move to rush forward. But before he could move, Dalton had already arrived in front of him. He slapped the knife in Tony's hand away.
"It's best to just let the two of them handle this matter. Let's just be spectators, shall we?"
Dalton said as he twisted Tony's arm behind his back. Tony grimaced in pain and closed his eyes. Fighting Dalton Steele head-to-head? What kind of joke was this?
"Dad, don't be afraid. Today I want to see what this trash thinks he can do. He already had the nerve to break into our home. I'm not going to let him get away with this," Jason said.
He clearly did not regard Tony with any respect at all. He yawned and walked over, lifting his arm to point a finger at Kevin's chest.
"You,"
he started to say. Kevin didn't even give him a chance to speak. He punched him hard in the stomach. Jason fell to his knees after just one punch. The intense pain caused his face to twist in agony. He gritted his teeth and gasped in pain. "You should learn when to shut your mouth," Kevin said as he kicked Jason in the back, crushing him under his foot. Kevin sneered and bent down to slap him across the face with the back of his hand. "It's true that this is your family's home, but when you come after my family, that gives me the right to have the final say here." Kevin leaned in closer and shook his head as he asked, "Do you know what you have done wrong?" Jason wanted to answer, but Kevin pressed his head against the ground, preventing him from uttering a single word. Because of the position he was in, Jason didn't dare to struggle anymore. He tried to stand up from under Kevin's foot, but he quickly realized that if he moved his face at all, it would scrape hard against the rough ground underneath him. Already, half of his face was covered in blood. Kevin spat out a mouthful of phlegm on the back of his head. "Even your father did not dare to speak to me in such a disrespectful way. So who do you think you are?" "Jason!" Tony called out. He was extremely anxious, but Dalton stepped in front of him to block his view. He refused to let him move forward to save his son.
Kevin, please let him go. Your wife's matter has nothing to do with me. Tomorrow I will take my whole family and leave Chicago. I'll do whatever you want me to do. Please, just let him go.
Leave Chicago? Do you really think you can leave without first resolving this situation? Kevin said firmly. You said you didn't do it. Why should I believe you? It's like stealing money. Would a thief admit what they did? Mr. Sorrento, are you naive, or do you just think that I, Kevin Williams, am stupid enough to believe you?
Kevin, I have already said that I didn't do it. I promise you that I had nothing to do with whatever is going on. I've never even seen your wife. I didn't agree with your decision at last night's banquet. That much is true. But that's just a business matter. It's nothing personal. I would never dream of harming your family because of a business matter. That isn't the way I do business.
Tony Sorrento pleaded, but no matter how anxious he was, his explanation seemed to fall short. Kevin still believed that Tony Sorrento had enough motivation to do this, and he didn't know him well enough to know if he was consistent with his character. But the way he spoke, it seemed more like he was trying to fool a 3-year-old child with his explanation. Any man who was capable of accumulating so much wealth with a reputation like his could not be trusted at face value. Kevin silently increased the force of his foot on Jason's back. Jason let out a series of miserable screams and his back caved in to a visible degree. I don't want to hear your useless explanations. From this point on, you have 2 minutes to think about it. You can either force me to kill every single member of your family, or you can hand over my wife, Kevin said coldly. His eyes began to turn red, and his breathing fluctuated intensely. It was as if he was about to explode.
Mr. Williams, please, surely you can present some evidence of what you're accusing me of. You keep saying that I did something to your wife. Then do you have any conclusive evidence to prove that I was the one who did this?
Tony Sorrento roared hysterically. My evidence is the fact that I have taken over your interests, and your family business has been lost overnight. Now you have no choice but to leave your hometown and start over elsewhere. Is that not enough motivation for you to make a move against me? Kevin said. Tony Sorrento clenched his fists, his chest heaving up and down. If not for the fact that he was certain he would lose, he really wanted to fight Kevin to the death. About 2 minutes had passed and Jason was clearly in pain. Kevin appeared very calm, as if he was just watching the clock.
All right, Kevin. You just want an explanation. All right then, let me tell you. Your wife was taken by me. Every debt has its debtor. Let the rest of my family go and do what you will with me. If you want to kill me, I'll let you decide,
Tony said as his shoulders sagged. He seemed to have made some kind of important decision, and he shouted the words with a firm look in his eyes. His behavior made Kevin squint his eyes. His cold eyes kept scanning Kevin's body. I will give you 12 hours. I want to see some results by then. Kevin slowly withdrew his right foot from Jason's back. But don't try to be smart and try to leave Chicago. Without my permission, you won't be able to leave this city alive. I can promise you that. After he finished speaking, Kevin left with Dalton and Rachel. After they left the house, Tony Sorrento quickly ran to his son to check his condition. His left cheek had been rubbed hard against the ground and was badly mutilated. A footprint was clearly visible on his back, and he was having trouble even standing up. It was obvious that several of his ribs were broken. Quickly, get my son to the hospital. Get the rest of our people out here and mobilize all the resources at our disposal. Even if they want to turn our world upside down, they still have to give us a chance. Tony Sorrento decisively gave the order.
Sir, do we really have to listen to this guy? No one has ever pushed us around like this before. Why not?
A younger member of the Sorrento family began to object, but he was not even allowed to finish his thought. Instead, Tony simply raised his right hand and made a throat-slitting gesture.
Get lost. Do you know how powerful Kevin Williams is? Fighting him head-on is no different than throwing an egg at a rock, you fool!" Tony Sorrento roared angrily. As time passed, people's identities kept changing. Not too long ago, Kevin was a nobody. Almost everyone could laugh at him and humiliate him without repercussions. When it came right down to it, he barely had more dignity than a beggar on the street. At that time, Kevin was as different as clouds and mud compared to a powerful man like Tony Sorrento. At that time, Tony Sorrento wouldn't even have had to lift a finger to kill him. But now, everything was different. As the CEO of the Williams Company, Kevin had turned into one of the most powerful people in Chicago in short order. And now he even had the likes of Adriana Wright, Mitchell Cook, and many others in his hands. What Kevin had said before he left said it all. If Tony Sorrento tried anything, then the Sorrento family would never be able to leave Chicago in one piece. After leaving the Sorrento villa, Kevin drove to the next location. Dalton could not help but ask,
"Kevin, what happened just now? Why did you suddenly let the Sorrento family go?"
Dalton turned to Rachel to try to find out what she was thinking about the strange events they just witnessed. It was clear to both of them that Kevin went to the Sorrento family tonight with murderous intentions. For him to give up halfway before even getting an answer was out of his character, especially when Lily's life was hanging in the balance. Kevin was a man who always had a plan, but just now neither Dalton nor Rachel had the slightest idea of what it was. After leaving the Sorrento family villa without an answer about Lily's whereabouts, Dalton and Rachel pressed Kevin for an explanation on why he gave up halfway through interrogating Tony and Jason Sorrento. Kevin looked forward and hesitated for a moment before answering. The reason is simple. Lily was not taken by the Sorrento family. Although Tony Sorrento was suspicious, his actions were purely to protect his own family members. There's no need to waste time on him.
"How can you be so sure?"
Dalton asked. He still couldn't figure it out. "Do you think a person like Tony Sorrento can do what he wants?" Kevin asked. As soon as he finished speaking, he stepped hard on the brake. The car, which had been driving relatively fast, left 2 long skid marks on the ground. Dalton and Rachel were caught off guard, and Dalton slammed into the back of the seats in front of him while Rachel hit her knees hard on the dashboard.
"Kevin, what the hell are you doing?"
Dalton said as he rubbed his head in pain. Rachel, on the other hand, was in so much pain that she almost cried. However, Kevin did not answer Dalton's question. He looked at the front of the car with a serious expression. Under the illumination of the lights by the roadside, there were 5 people standing quietly on the road. They were tall and slender. They seemed to have appeared out of thin air and were now standing in the middle of the road where Kevin's car could have easily run over them. "You guys stay in the car," Kevin said to Dalton and Rachel as he got out. Even though they were more than 20 feet away, he could still feel the hostility coming from the 5 of them. It was obvious that they were not blocking the road like this because they were just looking for money. "What are you doing in the middle of the road? Do I know you?" Kevin called out as he tensed up, not daring to be the slightest bit careless. Dalton and Rachel also noticed that something was not right, but they were not in a hurry to get out of the car. Both of them knew very well that if they could not help, blindly inserting themselves into the middle of the situation would only cause trouble for Kevin. None of the 5 of them answered Kevin's question, and they all just stood there quietly. "If you don't speak up, I'll just drive around you and continue on my way," Kevin said. He glanced back at the 2 people in the car behind him. When he finally turned around and prepared to get back into the car, the 5 of them moved in unison. A strong wind suddenly blew against his face, and Kevin's pupils immediately retracted. He hurriedly stepped back, and at the same time he loudly yelled, "Dalton, quickly get Rachel out of the car!" A moment later, a deafening sound rang out onto the quiet road. The luxury car behind them exploded violently, throwing Kevin, Dalton, and Rachel to the ground. But the 5 mysterious figures were not affected by the explosion at all. They stood beside the burning car and continued to watch Kevin.
The dancing flames lit up their faces. At that moment, Kevin was able to see that all 5 of them were wearing black masks. Only a pair of bright eyes were visible on each of their faces. Their eyes seemed to be filled with evil. Dalton and Rachel had managed to get out of the car just before the explosion. Rachel was so scared that her face turned pale. She tightly grabbed Dalton's arm and her long legs were visibly trembling. "You guys are going a bit too far, don't you think?" Kevin asked again with a serious expression on his face. He was not worried about the car, but he was worried about delaying too long. The more time he wasted, the more danger Lily would be in. "Who are you? Tell me honestly. Even if I die here tonight, you must at least let me die with an understanding of who I am up against, right?" Kevin said, his tone filled with anger. He made concessions again and again, but the people in front of him did not give him anything at all. Kevin was not afraid of these 5 people, but he also didn't know what to do next, and that was an unusual situation for Kevin. In the West Chicago International Group's office, many documents had been sent over by people from various fields in a very short period of time. Adriana Wright's desk and her coffee table were both filled with papers. Some of them were piled on the floor because there were no more clean surfaces to put them down on. The lowest of these contracts was worth a few $100 million. It was obvious that if all of them were successful, it would make for a terrifyingly large transaction volume. This was the benefit of Kevin building an alliance. However, Adriana Wright and the others were not in the mood to flip through so many documents. They had already been sorting through the contracts all night, and now they were singularly focused on the news on their phones. "In a short 4 hours, there were no traces left. It seems that those people have been planning to attack Mr. Williams' wife for a long time," Emo Squire said as he pushed his glasses up further on the bridge of his nose. "Don't you think there is something very strange going on here?" Adriana Wright frowned and said in deep thought. "Is there something strange?" Gilbert Rhodes said. "There was a person who was not at the banquet tonight who was someone we are all very familiar with and should not have been absent," Adriana Wright said hesitantly, as if she was considering if she should tell them what she was thinking. "You're talking about Mr. Cook, aren't you?" Emo Squire instantly reacted. "That's right. Why didn't Mr. Williams call Mitchell Cook to the banquet last night? Could it be that he was asked to do something else?" Gilbert Rhodes raised his head and asked in confusion. Adriana and Emo looked at each other and saw the shock in each other's eyes. "Did you guys notice? I don't know when it started, but Kevin and Mitchell's relationship started to become more subtle. Recently, Mitchell has very rarely even interacted with us," Adriana said as she scratched her head thoughtfully. "Don't tell me you're trying to say," Gilbert Rhodes started to say as he covered his mouth in disbelief. "It may not be what we think it is, but it's possible there may be something going on between the two of them," Emo Squire said firmly. At the Whistler Hotel, even though it was almost dawn, Mitchell Cook was still sitting in his office with a twisted expression on his face. At the same time, he was filled with mixed emotions. In the end, a subtle smile emerged on his face. The cigarette between his fingers was emitting a faint smoke. The ashtray on the table had been filled up and ashes were scattered everywhere. It could be clearly seen how many cigarettes he had smoked that night. Last night, Kevin gathered all of the top business people in Chicago, but he did not call him. Wasn't this a dangerous signal? Was he going to be eliminated from the current situation? Mitchell Cook really just wanted someone to come and give him a definitive answer. Dawn was the beginning of a new day. People woke up from their dreams and started a new journey. No matter what kind of treatment they faced, life still had to move forward 1 minute at a time. There was no retreat in life. Early in the morning in the suburbs of Chicago, the police had locked down a distance of about 2 miles. Dozens of police cars with flashing warning lights were parked behind the cordon. No one knew what had happened. Rachel was curled up on the ground in the middle of the road. Her pretty face was pale and there were some stains on her face. Her hair was messy. She no longer looked like the general manager of the Salix Leaf Hotel, but an insane woman who had made a bed out of a hard road. As an ordinary person, she had seen a scene that could subvert her entire perspective on life last night. In the woods that were about 300 feet away from Rachel, the thick trees were almost completely destroyed. Some of the trees were even still burning with raging flames. The 5 men lay on the ground weakly. Their hands and feet had all been broken by someone, and their bodies were covered with all kinds of terrible wounds. Kevin patted the dust off his body and walked up to them. He looked down at them coldly. The battle last night was extremely intense. These men were the strongest opponents Kevin had ever faced. If things had been just slightly different, the person lying on the ground at this moment could have been him. "Now you can say who you are, right?" Kevin raised his eyebrows and said with some tiredness. The 3-hour-long battle had consumed a lot of his energy, including his tensed nerves. Even Kevin couldn't take it anymore.
The Herbalist Society of Washington, D.C. Alpha Protocol,
the man stammered, wincing in pain. Perhaps the man on the ground was convinced by the results of the battle, or because his body had become completely numb, and he couldn't feel the intense pain caused by his injuries. Alpha Protocol? Kevin frowned. Kevin was going to have to work bit by bit to get the information he wanted out of these 5 strange beings. What was the meaning of these words? The Herbalist Society had an elaborate organization, and Kevin had never heard of this part, the Alpha Protocol, before. He could only imagine what kind of people could be ranked among them. Why have I never heard of this unit before? How many people do you have in total? And what is your power base? Kevin controlled the many questions running through his mind and continued to question the 5 seriously and calmly.
Alpha Protocol is a secret elite organization within the Herbalist Society. They are usually responsible for assassinating traitors.
The man looked at the gradually brightening sky and said without any hesitation,
I don't know how many people there are in Alpha Protocol. Normally no one will contact each other. They will only train in small groups.
And there are 5 people in a group? What is your ranking in Alpha Protocol? Kevin asked as his heart tightened. He thought to himself that the Herbalist Society's chairman was really not an easy person to deal with. He was extremely cautious.
The number of people in each group is also different. There should be very few people like us who are in groups of 5. Most of them are in groups of 7 to 8 people,
the person said as he suddenly shifted his gaze from the sky to Kevin. He added,
I know you are very strong, Kevin. I have to remind you that the trend of the world is irresistible. You are nothing but an ant compared to the Herbalist Society. It is always better to obey the Herbalist Society than to fight against it.
A man who is about to die still has the nerve to give his killer advice? Kevin couldn't help but let out a cold snort. Seeing that you are cooperating honestly, I promise that I will leave you with a complete corpse.
Oh, there's no need for that, the man replied.
This sentence shocked Kevin.
Since I entered the Alpha Protocol training program when I was just a child, I was destined to end up like this, the person said.
After an intense 3-hour battle with the 5 figures in black masks, Kevin walked up to one of the injured men who was lying on the ground. When he asked who they were, the man revealed that his team was part of the Herbalist Society's secret Alpha Protocol unit. Given that they were the strongest group that Kevin had faced thus far, he felt that their chairman was going to be difficult to deal with. When the man advised Kevin not to go up against the Herbalist Society, Kevin threatened to kill him. Kevin's mouth couldn't help but twitch as he slowly looked the man directly in the eye. Suddenly, the man's eyes widened as blood flowed out of his mouth, drawing a red streak across one side of his face. A few moments later, he had already stopped breathing. Kevin quickly crouched down to open the man's mouth. Upon inspection, the man had apparently bitten into a small pill hidden in his cheek. The other 4 men beside him also quickly followed suit. After making the same muffled sound, their pupils slowly dilated and their mouths spurted out blood upon their deaths. Seeing this scene, Kevin couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air in shock. Based on the man's final words, it turned out that before these 5 figures came to kill him, they were already prepared to fail and never return. What kind of extreme training did these people have to go through to make them disregard life and death so much? Just as he was thinking this over in his mind, Dalton Steele slowly opened his eyes. Half an hour ago, he sat cross-legged on the ground and surrounded himself with his spiritual energy to recover from his injuries.
Kevin, did you kill them all?
Dalton Steele looked at the corpses on the ground blankly. No, they committed suicide. Kevin shook his head lightly and answered. He then repeated the words Alpha Protocol repeatedly in his heart.
Did you get anything out of them? Don't tell me you don't know who was behind this yet.
Dalton asked with anticipation. It seems that I've underestimated the Herbalist Society. All this time I thought they were just a group of herbalists. I never expected that they would have such a great weapon in their hands. Kevin raised his head and looked in the direction of Washington, D.C. In 1 month's time, we shall meet again in the herbalism competition. The new day in Chicago had started out with a bang. With the cooperation of Adriana Wright and the others, the KWTD Corporation Chicago branch was officially established. Shortly after the announcement was made, more than 300 acres of land had been opened up on the north side of the city, with plans to build a new research and development facility for future technology there. There was also another piece of shocking news. With the Williams Company as its leader, the KWTD Corporation, the West Chicago International Group, and other local enterprises formed an alliance called the Prestige Club. At 9 o'clock in the morning, dozens of big shots had gathered at City Hall to meet with the mayor and were preparing to build a new commercial district on the west side. They were also investing hundreds of billions of dollars to set up a future business center in another part of the city. These sudden developments sent shockwaves throughout the entirety of Chicago to the point that it was the only thing its ordinary citizens were talking about. At the same time, without realizing it, Kevin had finished running through all the people on the list that Sandra Wilson had provided. The families who were confronted by him were all given a stern warning similar to the Sorrentos. However, none of them admitted to being the one behind Lily's kidnapping. As soon as he arrived back in the CEO's office of the Williams Company, Kevin made a call to Spencer, who had also not been idle after bringing people from the Radiance to work around the clock since last night to investigate the kidnapping. Unfortunately, he had yet to obtain any substantial results either. Spencer, I sent you a list of names. If I haven't called you again by noon, you can prepare some reliable people. Give each of them $5 million to take out a core member of those families, one by one. Then have them immediately call the police and surrender. Kevin's instructions were clear and concise. Yes, Mr. Williams. Spencer didn't ask any more questions. He would always put Kevin's orders first. After ending the call, Kevin tapped his finger nonstop on the table. Meanwhile, Dalton Steele was asleep on the sofa, snoring loudly from exhaustion. If it weren't for the fact that his company's soundproofing was so good, everyone on the floor would have been shocked to hear what was coming out from Kevin's office. You forced me to do this. Don't blame me for what's to come. Kevin rubbed his chest and uttered his frustrations in a low voice. Soon, it was already 12 o'clock, but Tony Sorrento and the others had not given him any news yet. Looks like some people are still not taking this matter seriously enough. Looks like I have no choice but to force these guys to speed things up. Kevin then sent a text message to Spencer with just 2 words. Do it. In less than 20 minutes, 2 people rushed into the hospital and stabbed a man dozens of times just as he had come out of the operating room. Poor Jason Sorrento. It wasn't easy for him to be pulled back from the gates of hell by the doctors, but now he was sent right back there for good. Such things happened one after another in the next half hour as several mansions throughout Chicago had turned into crime scenes. And the people who were killed were all key decision makers for their respective families. With news of these attacks spreading like wildfire all over the city, Its ordinary citizens fell into extreme shock and started to panic, not knowing who was behind all of this. Only the people who were directly involved in the matter knew very well that this was Kevin's way of secretly conveying that they were too slow, causing him to impatiently wave his butcher's knife at them. After all, it wasn't like this kind of thing had never happened before. However, no matter what methods they used, these people still couldn't find any clues about Lily's whereabouts. And as their homes were visited one by one, they couldn't help but curse out in vain at their other family members for having to take the blame and facing death on everyone's behalf. Despite this, Kevin wasn't anxious at all. Although he had not received any news yet about Lily, this was the best case scenario for him right now. No bad news was the best news. Suddenly, Kevin received a phone call from an unknown number. Upon seeing this, his eyes slightly narrowed and a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Was this the moment that he had been waiting for? He couldn't sit still in anticipation. Once the call was connected, an old and familiar voice was heard, but the greetings on the surface were omitted.
"Aren't you having too much fun playing God?"
Almost immediately, Kevin recognized whose voice it was. This came as a surprise to him. Given who it was, wouldn't it have been better to come straight to him? There was no need for him to make such a threatening call. "What do you mean? Explain yourself, Dean Ford." Kevin leaned back in his chair and crossed his legs on the table.
"Do you need to beat around the bush with me? Do you dare to tell me what's been happening all over Chicago since last night wasn't your doing?"
Wayne Ford's words carried some dissatisfaction.
"Kevin, don't think that no one in Chicago can stop you. You should act according to your own abilities. Don't make it so that everyone won't be able to get off the stage when the time comes."
"It seems that you're calling me to plead for someone." Kevin's face turned gloomy. "I'm also curious. Who can be involved with this matter?"
"That's not my point. Besides, who doesn't have any ties to other influential people nowadays?" Wayne continued. "I'm just reminding you there are laws at every level. Although there are no clear consequences, everyone follows them honestly. Don't try to be the one who sticks out like a sore thumb all the time."
These words were very serious. Kevin touched the stubble on his chin and became silent. Although he didn't understand why he wanted to help him, Kevin had never doubted Wayne Ford's position, and the fact that his actions had made Wayne Ford give him a subtle warning proved that someone powerful was putting pressure on him behind the scenes.
"Ordinary matters will take a long time to develop. Now that you've become a powerful expert within our realm, why are you still joining in on those minor pursuits?"
Wayne lectured him earnestly. People who were born to live in this world naturally had to have a set of rules to abide by in order to ensure that everyone could coexist in peace. For ordinary citizens, this was very simple since the government imposes laws that restrain them from simply doing anything they please. As such, if they did something that went against the law, they would definitely be severely punished based on their offense. At the same time, there were laws that experts like Kevin and Wayne Ford had to obey as well. However, these guidelines weren't as clearly stated in writing. It was just that they had been coexisting in this world with ordinary citizens for so long, so everyone knew right from wrong. And as long as they didn't abuse their power, the government usually steered clear of their internal affairs. However, while these laws had set up an ideal world on the surface, it didn't mean that there were actually no undercurrents simmering underneath. And whether it was among ordinary citizens or powerful experts, there was no lack of people with wild ambitions. The establishment of a business club will further support the economy of Chicago. Given that the Healing Arts School has been here for almost a year, don't tell me that you haven't seen the advantages of this city. Kevin didn't feel like he had done something wrong. Just like what he said, Chicago was a city by a lake with a thriving business hub and a lucrative commercial district. Unfortunately, those who didn't have enough strength to develop on their own had been suffering all this time. As such, being part of the business club would give them the opportunity to succeed by standing alongside others rather than against them.
Then are you telling me that you attacked all these families for the development of Chicago? Kevin, don't beat around the bush with me. Do you still want to hide the truth from me?
Wayne flatly refused his explanation.
Ask your men to stop immediately or else.
Kevin forcefully interrupted Wayne Ford's words and told him the truth behind his actions. Or else what? My wife and mother-in-law were taken away by someone. Am I not allowed to use my own resources to save them? He added, what's more, I didn't violate the rules of the game. The ones who did it were all ordinary people, and they had already surrendered themselves to the police. At the end of the day, those people just want a suspect and an explanation, so I gave them what they asked for.
You seem to be joking with me, right? If those people weren't afraid of your identity as a powerful expert, do you think that they would obediently listen to you?
Wayne felt somewhat anxious upon hearing this, and he couldn't help but raise his voice as a result.
Kevin, you have caused such a big commotion. If you just want news about your wife as long as you stop all this nonsense, then I can promise you that the Healing Arts School will help you find her.
Hearing this, Kevin's heart tightened. At first, Wayne Ford's words seemed to be a begging for mercy for Tony Sorrento and the others, but in fact, he was protecting Kevin from someone way more powerful. In this way, things became interesting. Which force was pressuring Wayne Ford? How powerful was this person or entity that Wayne Ford actually used the Healing Arts School's name just to try and stop him? However, Kevin understood his current situation very well. As much as he wanted to use every available resource at his disposal to find Lily, sometimes he also had to be mindful enough not to accept the help of others for their sake. At this point, he had already involved himself with too many enemies. This included the Morris family, the Herbalist Society, the Union, and the 10 grade schools, among others. As such, if he suddenly lost control and got caught off guard one day, any one of these major powers would be able to kill him without leaving a trace. Therefore, Kevin absolutely couldn't drag the Healing Arts School into this mess. Dean Ford, I appreciate your good intentions, but this matter doesn't need the help of the Healing Arts School. But don't worry, I know what I'm doing, and I'll never engage in something that I can't handle or isn't worth my effort. After saying this, Kevin hung up the phone and raised his hand to pinch the bridge of his nose as he closed his eyes. At the bottom of it all, Kevin knew that Wayne Ford had offered to help because his own strength was still too weak. At the same time, behind the Healing Arts School, there was a new building that had just been opened. These were the same reasons that had caused all his enemies to think that he was a figure that could be messed with. Kevin vowed not to be mistaken ever again for someone who could easily be beaten. Since none of the people on Kevin's list had been able to provide an update on Lily's whereabouts, he asked Spencer to kill a core member from each of their families, rattling the entire city. Suddenly, Wayne Ford called Kevin, urging him to stop these attacks and abide by the law. When he offered to help find Lily, Kevin wondered who was powerful enough to pressure Wayne behind the scenes. Initially, the stingy Harley Shepard didn't want to spend money on a new building and the expansion of the school. However, the opening of the Healing Arts School's campus in Chicago caused many people to flock here because of its renowned reputation. Although the Healing Arts School had already expected this and even planned to recruit more students in advance compared to last year, there were still too many applicants who were qualified for the upcoming semester. Most of them were from other cities, and since the Healing Arts School was a major power, it was impossible for them to send all these people back home just because they didn't have a place to stay. Otherwise, if word got out, they would probably become the laughingstock among the other schools. Therefore, no matter how cheap Harley Shepard was, he had no choice but to fork over a significant sum of money for this new building. Even Harley knew that there were benefits to building it. Aside from creating more dorms to accommodate everyone, there would now be significantly more room for learning and training on campus as well.
I told you that kid would refuse your offer, right?
However, you didn't believe me and insisted on making a fool out of yourself." Harley Shepard took a sip of coffee and glanced at Wayne Ford indifferently.
"Kevin may have rejected my offer, but I really want to help him. Without the protection of the Healing Arts School, it will be difficult for him to stay safe this time around."
Wayne Ford stroked his beard and a serious expression appeared on his face. "I wonder how much trouble he's planning to stir up. I can't even believe that he has already caused such a huge commotion." Harley pursed his lips and then let out a huge sigh. "How about I go and talk to him now? Maybe I can convince the stubborn kid to reconsider. And when the time comes, you can go out and help him so that this matter will be taken care of soon." Wayne Ford was not in a hurry to respond. Instead, he slowly thought about Harley Shepard's suggestion. After a long time, he shook his head a few times.
"I'm afraid it's not that simple. That person has come with menacing intentions. And unfortunately, I think he already set his eyes on Kevin."
Halfway through his words, Wayne Ford narrowed his eyes slightly. He then took a deep breath and continued.
"Besides, even if you try to convince him, I don't think Kevin would be willing to accept my help no matter what. Moreover, I don't even think that young man knows when he offended that person."
In the Swinton family's mansion in St. Louis, Richard Swinton and Alan Williams were staring intently at each other while Catherine Swinton was talking and laughing with Susan Williams as Brenda stood in front of them with a slightly red face.
"Alan, do you know about Kevin's recent movements?"
Richard Swinton took out a cigar and lit it. Although smoking had a certain effect on experts whose power base was below level 5, he couldn't bear to break old habits. However, Richard Swinton was still very polite. After the cigar was lit, he handed it first to Alan Williams. "What happened?" Alan Williams exhaled a puff of gray smoke. There was no sign of worry on his face. Even though Kevin was his son, he didn't brag about this to others. In addition, Alan Williams had long wanted to be a hands-off parent. Thus, he mostly preferred to stay away from his son's daily affairs, opting to just check in on him every once in a while instead.
"Actually, it's not a big deal. I just heard that someone wants to use the government's higher-ups to put the clamps on Kevin."
Richard also took a puff of smoke.
"Herman Thompson went to D.C. to try and smooth things over with his old connections, but until now, he hasn't returned with any news."
Hearing this, Alan suddenly frowned slightly. When it came to matter related to the government, things had to be taken seriously. After all, no matter how powerful they were, all the organizations and forces were built and operated under the consent of the government. Throughout the years, Alan Williams had seen many self-righteous people who felt that they were powerful enough to skirt the law and impose their will. "Although I haven't seen him for a long time, I believe that Kevin is a good kid. He won't do anything illegal." Although Alan said so, he couldn't help but still feel a little uneasy in his heart. It was soon 4 o'clock in the afternoon. At the Williams Company, Kevin was chatting with Dalton Steele when the door of his office was suddenly pushed open. 5 or 6 people quickly walked in one after another with Tony Sorrento at the front of the group. "Hey, the big shots have finally arrived." Kevin slowly stood up from the sofa. He smiled and rubbed his hands. "Let me guess. You're here to give me some good news. Am I right?" Seeing Kevin like this, Tony Sorrento and the others didn't know how to react, and the huge smile on Kevin's face only made them panic even more in their hearts. Life was like this. When people were at different levels in terms of status, it was hard to understand what the person on top was thinking behind his words, making those at the bottom instinctively feel fear of the unknown. No matter what kind of outer disposition the person actually had, it was very difficult to decipher their state of mind. In fact, this was the same logic behind people's fear of the dark, which stemmed from not knowing what potential hidden dangers they faced. For example, Kevin's intensity directed at Tony Sorrento and the others caused them to blame and attack their own family members as soon as he left. Moreover, Kevin had already taken many lives through his men, so they couldn't afford to act tough in front of him.
We can't be blamed for everything that has happened, President Williams. We all tried our best, but it seems that the Dark Hand who's responsible for this remains in the shadows and is too smart to leave any trace that would reveal himself.
One of the men explained. That's right, President Williams. Over the past few hours, we have exhausted all of our resources. Another lowered his head. If possible, I hope you can give us some more time. A third one pleaded. These big shots who were famous enough to normally cause other people's expressions to change immediately in public were now acting like humble subordinates in front of Kevin. Hearing their excuses and pleas for mercy, Kevin's face gradually became gloomy. Although he had already guessed as much before, hearing this conclusion with his own ears and accepting it would take some time. You should all know very well by now that the answers you're giving me are not what I want to hear. Kevin narrowed his eyes and his tone became colder and colder. Dalton Steele, who was standing behind him, became even more intimidating as he looked at Tony Sorrento and the others with eyes full of disdain. He then held his fist together and cracked his knuckles as if to show that he was ready to beat them all up at any moment. Although your families can't compare to the top families in Chicago and powerful figures like Adriana Wright, I didn't expect that you would be this worthless. Is your efficiency really so low? Kevin scanned the group and added, or is the pressure that I've given you still not enough? Tony Sorrento and the others' pupils dilated when they heard this. In the past hour, Kevin had started to exert even more pressure on them. He was no longer playing tricks behind their backs, but doing so right out in the open. Kevin wanted to use his men to fight one-on-one with members of the families on his list. In some cases, they were even willing to take on what could be a deadly challenge if it meant forcing the other families to also cave to Kevin's demands and be weakened by his attacks on them. After committing murder, they then took the initiative to call the police and turn themselves in, so that Tony Sorrento and the others couldn't find a way to take revenge even if they wanted to. As such, Tony Sorrento's chest rose and fell violently, and his fist suddenly clenched tightly without him even noticing. His eyes also flashed as if he was struggling with something.
President Williams, please believe us. Your wife's matter really has nothing to do with us.
One of the men behind him begged.
Even if you eliminate all of our families, it will not have any effect in the end.
These 4 or 5 people were currently terrified to their core. It wasn't just the fact that they had not experienced this kind of feeling for many years, but that they never felt as powerless as they were here today. What I want is not an excuse for your failure, but the result of a successful investigation. Since there are people who want to fish in troubled waters, let me tell you that I'm also not afraid of causing harm to myself in order to destroy the enemy. Anyway, it's getting late, so you should all go back to your homes. I'm sick of looking at you already. Kevin waved his hand and ordered them to leave. However, even after a few minutes, no one dared to lift a foot or make any noise. This was because everyone knew that if they left now, it would be no different from being sentenced to death. At the same time, they kept cursing in their minds about their current predicament. What the hell was Kevin planning to do to them and their families? Don't think that you can live peacefully just because you're wasting your time here. I don't even need to lift a finger to deal with you guys. Kevin saw through their thoughts with a single glance. Suddenly, Tony Sorrento, who had been silent this entire time, took 2 steps forward. Seeing this, Dalton immediately stood in front of Kevin, worried that Tony Sorrento would do something stupid.
President Williams, if you found out the identity of the murderer behind the scenes, will you stop this violence and let everyone go?
Tony Sorrento didn't pay any attention to Dalton as he stared directly at Kevin. As long as you bring my wife back to me, you can do whatever you want for the rest of your lives without my interference. Kevin glanced at him and answered. To be honest, he wasn't afraid that Tony Sorrento would do something impulsive. Given Kevin's power base, dealing with this ordinary person was no different than pinching an ant to death. Tony took a deep breath and explained slowly.
Good. Every injustice has its debtor, and it's time for me to come clean and tell you the truth. Last night I found someone to kidnap your wife and your mother-in-law from your home. I then threw them personally into the lake where they drowned to their deaths. So now that you know what happened, kill me and spare the rest."
Before he could finish speaking, Kevin suddenly lunged forward. In less than a second, he grabbed Tony Sorrento's neck and pushed him against the wall, staring at him with murderous intent. The noise this made shocked everyone on the floor. They all looked at Kevin's office and wondered what the commotion was all about. "Can you repeat what you just said one more time?" Kevin held Tony Sorrento's neck tightly as his body emitted fiery spiritual energy. Tony Sorrento could no longer say anything. His face became red before quickly turning purple as he struggled to breathe from the pressure on his neck. This showed just how much strength Kevin was exerting on his neck at the moment. At the same time, the expressions of the others changed drastically, but because of the spiritual energy that Kevin was emitting, they didn't dare to make any rash moves.
"Kevin!"
Dalton quickly walked over and held Kevin's shoulder.
"Don't be so impulsive."
Dalton didn't really care about Tony Sorrento's life or death. Rather, what he only cared about was where Tony Sorrento died. After all, it would be quite troublesome if word got out that someone had died here in Kevin's office. Kevin turned around and looked at Dalton in understanding. He then took a deep breath before shoving Tony Sorrento to the ground. At this moment, Tony Sorrento was kneeling on the ground, covering his neck with both hands and gasping for air. It was as if he had just escaped from death. The office instantly became quiet while everyone stared at Tony Sorrento. "You didn't do it." Kevin finally suppressed the anger in his heart. "It's not that I look down on your abilities, but I can tell that you just don't have the courage to do it. I don't like liars." Tony Sorrento and a few other heads of their families anxiously informed Kevin that they still couldn't find the person responsible for taking Lily. Kevin was displeased and told them to go home. But afraid of what Kevin would do to their families, none of them dared to leave. Suddenly, Tony stepped forward, telling him that he threw Lily and Dorothy to their deaths in a lake. Kevin grabbed Tony's neck to confront him, and as Tony struggled to catch his breath, Kevin could tell that he didn't have the courage to pull off such a stunt. Just then, Kevin's phone rang. After hesitating for a moment, he finally took it out to check who was calling. It was Spencer, who immediately said,
"Mr. Williams, the matter has been investigated, but you have to be mentally prepared."
Hearing the rest of Spencer's report, Kevin became more and more somber with each passing second. By the end of it, the expression on his face had become almost completely blank. After hanging up the phone, Kevin looked at everyone present as he slowly returned to the sofa to sit down. The rest of the people, including Tony Sorrento, who was still recovering from being nearly strangled by angry Kevin, did not even dare to breathe loudly as they all looked at Kevin with uneasiness in their hearts. Another few moments passed in tense silence. Kevin then raised his hands together to support the bridge of his nose and instructed slowly, "You guys can leave. The matter has already been investigated, so this marks the end of your ordeal. Leave Chicago as soon as possible, and don't ever come back here again." The sudden change in Kevin's demeanor made these people unable to react as they looked at each other in confusion. Finally, one of them mustered up enough courage in his heart.
"President Williams,
I said get lost." Kevin didn't hold back his anger any longer and shouted loudly. The others immediately understood and nodded without a fuss. They then helped Tony Sorrento up from the ground and quickly left Kevin's office.
"What happened, Kevin?"
Dalton Steele frowned slightly. He also realized that something wasn't right. "Come with me, Dalton." Kevin let out a long breath. In the office of the Whistler Hotel, Mitchell Cook had just sent away 2 business partners. Although the most famous hotel in Chicago was the Salix Leaf Hotel, Rachel had mostly been focused on expanding its real estate arm ever since she became its general manager. In the food and beverage industry alone, the Whistler Hotel was still considered the leading hotel in the city. "Sir, Mr. Williams is here." A staff member of the hotel quickly came in and reported to Mitchell Cook.
"Okay, I got it."
Mitchell Cook only nodded his head and didn't do anything else while he waited. A few minutes later, Kevin brought Dalton along with him into the office. By the time they entered, Mitchell Cook had already made some coffee for his guests.
Kevin, why didn't you tell me in advance that you were coming by to say hello? That way I could have had more time to prepare something for you guys.
Mitchell Cook smiled and gestured for the two of them to sit down. Are you planning to run away, or are you going to give me another lame excuse to not see me? Kevin picked up the cup of coffee on the table and sniffed it. Is this Black Ivory coffee? Even Kevin couldn't help but be shocked. The one and only other time he had this drink was back at the Huxley family's mansion in St. Louis. Dalton Steele's expression changed when he heard it. As one of Chicago's most feared and powerful men, he had enjoyed many luxury goods in his lifetime, but this coffee was a legendary treat. Black Ivory coffee was known as the most expensive coffee in the world, with its beans naturally refined in Thailand. With an annual output not exceeding 500 pounds, its beans were almost exclusively allocated to the most prestigious five-star hotels in the world. Who knew the Whistler Hotel would be one of them?
That's right. As expected, you certainly have a refined sense of smell.
Mitchell still maintained a faint smile. I'm not here to taste coffee. Kevin slowly put down his coffee cup and slightly raised his head to look Mitchell in the eye. You know why I'm here, right? Where is she? Why did you do this? In all of our years of friendship, have I ever mistreated you?
Please calm down, Kevin. May I ask if you know how old I am this year?
Mitchell didn't answer any of Kevin's questions, but asked his own instead with an unusually calm expression. Kevin frowned when he heard him. He didn't know what Mitchell Cook had meant by asking him this.
I'm guessing you don't know, right? I'm already 48 years old this year. It's said a person is no longer aimlessly wandering around at 40, and by the time he reaches 50 years of age, he should already have his life's purpose figured out. That being said, I lived up to my moral character a lot when I was young. But now that I'm much older, that side of me has almost been worn down by time.
Mitchell gently took a sip of coffee and closed his eyes. He then smacked his lips a few times as he tasted the distinctive notes of chocolate, malt, and spice in his mouth. The coffee was so smooth and delicious that it was as if the bitterness in life had come to an end with a single sip. So it was really you who was behind Lily's kidnapping? Kevin raised his eyebrows. Having known you for years, I'm afraid that this alone is hard to believe. Mitchell Cook waved his hands a few times and replied,
Everyone's background is different from each other's. You were born into a very rich family in New York City as a young heir. You may have known me these last few years, but how do you know what I've experienced in my lifetime?
Did you do it because of Drake? Kevin said as he played with the coffee cup in his hand.
It's been said that life is full of ups and downs. But how many of those did I experience in exchange for my current rise and fall? I don't deny that if it wasn't for you, I definitely wouldn't have achieved anything close to my status today. Without the kindness that you extended to me, perhaps I would have long starved to death on the streets.
Mitchell seemed to be recalling his past. Kevin decided not to disturb him, so Mitchell had enough time to fully express his thoughts. As the saying goes, when a man is about to die, his words are always kind and poignant. At the moment Mitchell Cook found out that Kevin had brought Dalton Steele here, he had already understood his intention. Given this, Mitchell Cook knew that he didn't have any chance to fight Kevin head-on. Thus, it was better to let either of them end his life swiftly when it was time. Kevin's right index finger slowly tapped on the back of his left hand. When he heard Mitchell Cook's words, his face didn't change at all and his heart remained firm. However, there was a puzzled look in his eyes. As for Dalton, things were different. Not knowing their past history, he didn't really understand what they were talking about, and it was rare for him to ask about one of Kevin's conversations. Given this, he simply leaned back on the sofa and quietly watched. At the same time, Dalton didn't care whose territory this was. In any case, with his and Kevin's combined strength, the two of them together would be able to do whatever they wanted anywhere in Chicago. Mitchell continued,
Kevin, I'm actually very grateful to you. When I was at my lowest point, it was you who gave me the greatest favor. It was as if you allowed me to obtain a chance at being reborn with a second life. That's why I've always respected and appreciated you deep in my heart. It's possible that these things are insignificant to you. After all, you saved a lot of people in the past, and I was just lucky enough to be one of them. Kevin, you have to believe me. In the past, I really wanted to assist you well and even stand at the highest point of this world with you. But my life has been filled with too many variables as of late.
Mitchell lowered his head slightly and looked at the smoke rising from his burning cigar.
After Drake was forced to leave Chicago, I began to think, what's the point of me working so hard for so long? As I'm getting older, I have to shake off all my burdens and start living for myself.
Are you done? Kevin took a sip of coffee and blinked a few times. Mitchell Cook was shocked. He didn't understand what Kevin meant. Based on what he knew about Kevin, things shouldn't be as calm as they were now. Instead, it would have been normal for him to explode in an instant if it was someone else who had offended him this much. If you're done talking, then it's now my turn to ask you something, and I want you to answer me truthfully this time. Why did you do it? Kevin turned the coffee cup in his hand and looked at the exquisite patterns printed on it. Don't tell me that it's merely because you've lost your will to live. I'm not a 3-year-old child, so don't treat me like a fool. It will be better if you tell me honestly.
What do you mean, Kevin? I have no reason to lie to you.
Mitchell suddenly replied with a crooked smile. Kevin didn't reply immediately after he finished speaking. Instead, he put his coffee cup down and crossed his arms in front of his chest to make it clear that he was going to wait for Mitchell's explanation. Given his reputation and their history, Kevin knew Mitchell Cook's character too well. Despite the sob story that he had just given, Mitchell wasn't the type of person who would give up on life. If that was the case, then he would have starved to death on the streets many years ago. Why would he have to continue to suffer until today? Because of this, Kevin was sure that Mitchell must have encountered some kind of crisis. If not, perhaps someone had offered him a higher price or some other lucrative offer that Kevin would never have been able to give him.
Kevin, there's no need to ask about my motives anymore. All you have to know is that I'm the one who did it, and I alone can bear the responsibility.
Mitchell replied faintly. No one noticed that his hands, which had been under the coffee table, had been clenched so tightly that his nails were about to be pinched into his flesh. However, his face didn't show any change in reaction. Did you do it? Did you really do it? Kevin's tone became louder and louder. Tell me, why did you dare to do this to me only now? If you never liked me in the past, you could have killed me before I was expelled from the Williams family.
At that time, you were just a stray dog. If I killed you back then, it would only lower my own status.
Mitchell interrupted Kevin, who was roaring furiously at this point. He then stared at Kevin fearlessly. Are you really forcing me to kill you? Kevin's brows were tightly knitted together and his nose couldn't help but twitch a few times. Just by looking at him, it wasn't hard to tell that Kevin was on the verge of losing his self-control.
Kill me now, Kevin. All of this will end once I die. You can find Lily at the second dock of Calumet Harbor inside the container that's furthest back on the right.
Mitchell suddenly looked at the expensive watch on his wrist and then added,
You still have half an hour to go. If you arrive there too late, your wife might already be submerged in the lake. I'm not trying to scare you, but this isn't a joke.
Kevin suddenly sprang up from the sofa. As he stared at Mitchell Cook, his eyes were like two sharp swords that were about to slice him into pieces. Moreover, his chest heaved up and down continuously as he seemed to be considering whether he should kill Mitchell first before saving Lily.
Kevin, you don't have much time. Go and save them. Leave this man to me.
Dalton Steele decisively reminded him of what was more important at the moment. All right, Dalton, take care of him for me. Kevin suddenly waved his hand, sending out a gust of air so strong that instantly shattered the coffee table in front of him. As part of the port in Chicago, Calumet Harbor could be said to be an important source of economic support for the entire city. This place would bring in hundreds of millions of dollars worth of goods every day. In the corner of the docking area, two burly men were sitting on the ground and smoking cigarettes. The container behind them was not sealed off.
and the slanted rays of sunlight just happened to reveal the faces of Lily and Dorothy, who were tightly tied up inside. Their hands and feet were tied up by rope, and there was black tape covering their mouths. Their faces were full of fear and panic, especially Dorothy, whose right cheek had a red palm print that was still clearly visible.
Why did the boss let us handle this kind of job?
A man took a big puff of smoke and impatiently complained.
What else can we do about it? If we dared to refuse what he asked of us, we could be the ones tied up in that container right now. I don't want to die,
his partner calmly replied.
It's a pity for that woman, though. She's so beautiful, but it'll all be wasted once she sinks to her death in this lake. What a shame.
After being confronted about Lily's kidnapping, Mitchell Cook had already accepted the fact that he was about to die. He then revealed that Lily was at a dock in Calumet Harbor and Kevin had half an hour before the container she was in would be submerged into the lake. Dalton urged Kevin to prioritize saving Lily and offered to take care of Mitchell on his behalf. With that, Kevin left for Calumet Harbor, where two burly men were discussing how it was a pity they had to drown a beautiful woman like Lily.
Hey, I suddenly thought of something. Since both of them are going to die anyway, why don't we take advantage of the fact that the boss hasn't called yet to have some fun with them?
The man then revealed a lewd smile.
A mother and daughter tandem? Just thinking about it makes me excited. Why not? It's not like they can do anything about it, and with them about to die, no one will know,
his partner sneered. The two of them bumped their fists together in agreement. After looking around carefully and seeing that the coast was clear, they then threw away their cigarettes and rubbed their hands excitedly as they got into the container. Although they were tied up, Lily and Dorothy could clearly hear the conversation between the two men, and when they saw the two men approaching them, Lily and Dorothy desperately tried to slide themselves further into the other end of the container. While doing so, Dorothy kept hiding behind Lily's back even though her mouth was covered. She tried to make pleading sounds as if begging the two men not to harm them. Just as one of the men's hands was about to reach for Lily's legs, an angry roar suddenly echoed from outside. "Don't you dare lay a finger on her!" As soon as these words were spoken, the four of them looked toward the opening of the container and saw Kevin standing there. His eyes were red, and his entire body was emitting a cold and vicious aura. Even the warmth of the afternoon sun couldn't cancel the hostility in the air. Seeing his timely arrival, Lily's eyes filled with tears. Dorothy continued to struggle hard as she turned her body around to face him. Her muffled cries for help had now turned into shouts of joy.
"Who the hell are you?"
one of the men fired back impatiently.
"Can't you see that we're in the middle of something? Don't you dare meddle in other people's business, do you hear me? If you know what's good for you, then you better get the hell out of here."
Kevin didn't seem to hear him. He quickly entered the container and walked up to the man to slap him hard on the face with the back of his hand. With a loud slapping sound, the man instantly fell to the ground and blood flowed out of his nose and mouth.
"You must have a death wish, don't you?"
The man's partner took out a dagger from his waist and gulped as he prepared to attack. Kevin glanced at him indifferently for a second and then swiftly grabbed the person's wrist and pulled it with force. Lily and Dorothy, who were watching by the side, could clearly hear a cracking sound.
"Ah!"
The man let out a miserable scream as his face turned red and his eyeballs almost popped out in pain. However, Kevin didn't seem to care about these signs of near-fatal suffering. Without giving the man any chance to recover, he then punched him in the abdomen, causing him to curl up into a ball as his body trembled violently from top to bottom.
Please stop. Don't kill me. I'm no one. I was just following orders,"
the man gasped. It was obvious that he was scared of Kevin. "Following orders? From the moment you and your partner started to have evil thoughts about my wife, you immediately threw away your chance of living." The cold light that shot out from Kevin's eyes was enough to leave the person in front of him frozen in horror. A second later, Kevin grabbed the man by his hair,
and slammed his body into the container walls several times, as if he was pulling and throwing a sandbag. The man kept screaming and begging for mercy, but after a while, it seemed that he just stopped struggling. When Kevin finally let go of him, the man collapsed to the ground like a rag doll. However, Kevin wasn't done venting his anger just yet. He proceeded to kick the seemingly lifeless man a few more times until he was content. Seeing this, the man who had been slapped to the ground earlier by Kevin briefly thought about standing up and running away. However, he decided to stay lying down with his eyes closed instead, pretending to be unconscious to avoid a further beating. After calming himself, Kevin slowly walked toward Lily. However, when he arrived in front of her, he lowered his head slightly and didn't dare to look into her eyes. He then shakily untied the rope on her body and prepared to leave. Lily quickly tore off the tape on her face and turned around to untie Dorothy. "Wait a minute." Lily suddenly opened her mouth and called out to him. "Where are you going? Don't tell me I no longer have a place in your heart." "It's not that." Kevin didn't know what else to say. Right now, he didn't have the courage to face Lily. After being freed by Lily, Dorothy originally wanted to yell at him for being kidnapped yet again. But when she saw the two people still lying on the ground, especially the one on whom Kevin had vented so much of his anger, she didn't dare to say anything to him. "What is it? Mom and I were kidnapped because of you this time, and now you want to leave again just because you already saved us? Do you think you'll get away with this that easily?" Lily pretended to be angry and quickly walked over to Kevin. She then grabbed his hand and tugged him lightly. "Come home with me. See how I'll deal with you when we get back." Lily added, "Is it because I haven't asked you how you're feeling today? Are you okay?" Hearing Lily's simple words were like music to his ears. Kevin suddenly revealed a gratified smile. At the West Chicago International Group's headquarters, Emo Squire and Adriana Wright were having a discussion with Tyler Dawn about the KWTD Corporation's expansion into Chicago. On paper, Kevin's establishment of the Prestige Club seemed to be all smooth sailing, but there was one thing that everyone was well aware of. Aside from Kevin's inner circle, the rest of the Business Alliance members were only doing it for the sake of profit, and they were only willing to stay as long as they could still reap its benefits. In other words, their loyalty wasn't absolute, and if Kevin lost all his power that same day, they would definitely scatter like rats fleeing a sinking ship. Therefore, if they wanted to tie those people firmly to Kevin's boat, they had to have some bargaining chips that could hold their hearts. Just then, Rachel hurriedly walked in from outside and informed the others with a flustered expression. "Something happened. I just received news that Dalton Steele took Mitchell away from the Whistler Hotel." "What?" Adriana Wright suddenly stood up and was in disbelief. "How could this be? Are you sure that your information is reliable?" "Adriana, if such a big matter wasn't confirmed, then why would I bother to tell you?" Rachel hurriedly replied. "Besides, did you all not receive the news?" Adriana Wright and Emo Squire looked at each other when they heard this, and then they became silent. In Tyler Dawn's case, since he had just arrived and the resources in his hands had not yet been spread out in Chicago, it would be somewhat acceptable for him to say that he had not received any news. But Adriana Wright and Emo Squire were different. Both of them were mainstays with deeply established roots in Chicago. Furthermore, they had a good relationship with Mitchell Cook. If they didn't receive the news, it could only mean one thing. Someone didn't want them to know about this matter, so they deliberately blocked the news from them. "Adriana, Emo, how can the two of you still remain so calm?" Rachel was so anxious that she was like a lobster in a boiling pot. "Do you want me to call Dalton now, or perhaps Kevin?" Rachel immediately took out her phone and was ready to call either of them.
"There's no need for you to do that."
Emo Squire waved his hand casually.
"Since Dalton Steele dared to attack Mitchell, it means that he was ordered by Kevin himself. Thus, even if you called, it wouldn't have any effect on the matter."
"You mean to say that Kevin was behind this?" Rachel was in shock.
How could this be? Kevin and Mitchell are clearly...
There are some things that we don't know, so we can't assume what will or will not happen. Emo forcefully interrupted Rachel's words. Anyway, we do not need to worry about this matter. Kevin should be able to take care of it. Although no one could guess Kevin's true intention in this matter, the best course of action at the moment was to simply wait and see. In the Salix Leaf complex, Dorothy immediately went upstairs alone after returning home. No one knew what she was doing in her room. Meanwhile, Lily changed into her casual clothes and then went back downstairs. She was half lying on the sofa with one hand supporting her head and the other holding a bunch of freshly washed grapes. While Lily relaxed and snacked on the couch, Kevin was busy doing the household chores that Dorothy and her daughter still expected him to carry out. With his sleeves rolled up, one hand was holding a broom while the other had a towel. Moreover, he was also wearing a colorful apron.
"Are you done sweeping over there?" Lily asked from the living room. "What time is it? Did you buy the vegetables? When are you cooking dinner? I'm starving," she added.
Lily was like a queen, lying leisurely on the sofa and giving instructions to Kevin every so often. "Dinner will be ready soon. After I'm done cleaning up, I'll start cooking. I've already called someone to bring some groceries over. How about we have some salad and chicken casserole tonight?" Although Kevin was very busy, he was not flustered by any of Lily's requests. In fact, he even had a silly smile on his face the entire time, as if he was very happy to be ordered around by Lily and do all these things for her. At that moment, he suddenly had a vision that he had returned to his life a year ago, back when he was still just a nobody in the Jones family's universe. Although his life wasn't anything special back then, he could at least spend most of his time close to Lily. After returning to their apartment from Calumet Harbor, Lily didn't mention anything about the kidnapping. It was as if the matter had been swept under the rug in favor of some sense of normalcy. Unfortunately, Kevin was still unable to break through to the last step of reconciling with Lily as he wished. This was because he felt that, deep down, all of these recent events had still weighed heavily on both of them. Therefore, he had no choice but to take things slowly but surely with her. Soon after, the delivery staff sent over the vegetables that Kevin had ordered online. He then went to the kitchen, which he knew all too well. There he cut all the chicken and other ingredients that he needed, sautéed the vegetables, stirred in the meat and other stuff together, added the toppings, and put the dish into the oven. While waiting, he then prepared some salad for them as well. Once the chicken casserole was baked and laid out on the dining table, Kevin came out of the kitchen with a towel to wipe his hands. He then looked at Lily on the sofa and felt a warm glow inside of him. Although days like this seemed dull for most people, being with Lily and taking care of her was more than enough to make his heart full. "By the way, Lily, when I have to leave Chicago again for a while, why don't you take care of the company for me?" Kevin brought up thoughtfully.
"Kevin, that's your company. Why should I go work there?"
Lily frowned and asked.
"Besides, the Williams Company is so big, and you always come into contact with powerful clients. Do you think I have the ability to manage it for you? Don't blame me if your company loses accounts and closes down all of a sudden."
"I'm sure you'll do a fine job. You can quickly learn on the fly as you gain more experience. Besides, Sandra Wilson will be there to help you every step of the way, and I will also call Adriana Wright and the others again to give you some additional guidance. Also, your cousin Nicole is currently the company's senior client partner. If you do this, won't you be able to work together with her?" Kevin tried to persuade her with a smile. When Nicole Jones found out about Kevin's identity, she immediately asked him to give her a job at the Williams Company. However, although she went to the company as a favor to Lily, her progress up the ladder was very fast, and in just a few months she worked hard to rise through the ranks. Little did Nicole know that she had barely escaped the same end as the rest of the Jones family, who were eliminated when Nicole just happened to be on a business trip for the company. Kevin hoped that this twist of fate would make Nicole forever loyal to him, but Kevin had also learned that loyalty wasn't a quality that everyone in his life had. After rescuing Lily, Kevin had seemingly been relegated back to his previous life, doing house chores and cooking food while happily obliging to being ordered around by Lily as a means of slowly reconciling with her. Kevin suggested that Lily should manage the Williams Company the next time he had to leave Chicago. While Lily had her reservations, Kevin reassured her that she would be guided by Sandra Wilson and the rest of his inner circle, and she would get to work together with her cousin Nicole, who had worked her way up to become the company's senior client partner. This, Lily started to say as she heard Nicole Jones's name and immediately perked up. With the Jones family no longer around, Nicole was her only other surviving family member aside from Dorothy. Moreover, having grown up together, the two cousins were quite close, so being able to spend more time with her would be an added bonus for Lily. Well then, this matter is settled. Tomorrow you will come with me to the company. Kevin could tell that she had easily been convinced and immediately made the decision to accept the duties Kevin gave her. Deep down, he had his own reasons for doing this. Before long, Kevin was planning to go on a trip to Washington, D.C. As such, he couldn't afford to suffer any form of chaos in his company during his absence. Although he had already used his recently established business alliance along with some force to chase away those who opposed him, Kevin still didn't feel at ease leaving the Williams Company to Sandra alone to take care of. With so much at stake, he felt that, as his wife, Lily was the person whom he could trust the most to keep the company's affairs in check. Moreover, there had been so many threats to Lily's life recently, and while he had managed to save her every time so far, it didn't mean that he could be so lucky every time, especially if he was all the way in D.C. Given this, Kevin figured that the Williams Company would be the safest place for her to be. That way it would be easier to keep an eye on her. In both cases, there would always be matters in Chicago that he had no time to take care of. Therefore, it was best to place Lily right at the center of it all. The night passed very quickly. When Kevin was about to go to sleep that night, he took the initiative to sleep on the couch. However, he was suddenly pulled to the bed by Lily, whose face was slightly red as she still pretended to be angry with him. Although the two of them remained silent when this happened, Kevin ended up hugging his wife and sleeping soundly the whole night. When he woke up the next morning, Kevin felt refreshed. It was as if he had been given a new lease on life. After making breakfast for the both of them and getting ready, Lily went with Kevin as they drove to the office. "Your office is quite stylish," Lily couldn't help but remark as she kept looking around. This was the Williams Company, considered a star-making factory not just in Chicago but across the entire Midwest. It was definitely not a place that ordinary people could enter without being amazed. In fact, it was perfectly normal for Lily to have such a reaction. Because she had long gotten used to Kevin's unassuming appearance and demeanor, there was a surprise in her heart when she first found out that Kevin was actually the high-powered president of the Williams Company. But hearing about it was one thing. Only when she saw everything that Kevin had with her own eyes did she begin to understand what this title truly meant. From the moment she got out of the car up to the moment they entered this magnificent office, countless employees showed the utmost respect toward him, and it could even be said that they were all deliberately trying to go out of their way to please him. Lily's heart was filled with a strong sense of awe for her husband. She kept thinking in her mind, if Kevin was already this admired and loved, then what would become of him in the future? Kevin had finally turned her idea from a few years ago into reality. He worked hard to become the best version of himself, to the point that not only was she not considered his equal, but she felt like she was even several steps below him. In the future, would she still be worthy of Kevin? Lily didn't have an answer to this question in her heart, but it could be said that no one else could give her an accurate answer either. "Kevin, this is impressive. I had no idea that you had led Williams Media to such great success." Hearing Lily's words, Kevin suddenly felt a little proud. He couldn't help but straighten his back just a little bit. "Lily, everything that I have now is also all yours." Kevin brought Lily to the window. From their vantage point, almost half of the city of Chicago could be seen below them. "Kevin," Lily was about to say something when the office door was pushed open from the outside. A second later, Sandra Wilson slowly walked in. "President Williams, this is the document that Director Dawn sent over. You need to sign it yourself." Although Sandra was talking to Kevin, her eyes had been looking at Lily the entire time. At the same time, Lily's gaze had also been fixed on Sandra, who was dressed much more professionally than she was, and seemed to be in control of every business situation from the moment she walked into the office. Although the two women had not met before, their eyes collided fiercely with each other, creating an invisible spark in the air. Kevin, who had just received the document, suddenly felt the temperature in the office drop, to the point that he felt a slight chill running down his spine. Only then did he notice Lily and Sandra silently having an intense stare-down with one another. "Miss Wilson," Kevin coughed awkwardly. "Kindly pour us 2 cups of coffee." "Yes, sir, President Williams." Sandra answered respectfully and looked away from Lily. As the office door closed, Kevin felt uneasy in his heart. Even though there was nothing going on between him and Sandra, he realized that pairing the two women in his absence might not be such a good idea after all. Given this, he quickly lowered his head and focused his attention on the document in his hands. "Not bad, President Williams. When did you find such a beautiful assistant? Why didn't you introduce me to her just now?" Lily narrowed her eyes as the tone of her voice changed. "Sandra has worked at the company for a long time. She was actually here before me. And she's much more than just an assistant." Kevin scratched his head but didn't dare to look directly into her eyes. "Sandra? Why are you suddenly referring to her by her first name when she just called you President Williams?" Lily clenched her fist tightly as she gave him a death stare. It wasn't that she didn't believe Kevin, but Lily was a woman too. Of course, she could clearly see the way Sandra Wilson looked at her and treated Kevin. How could such a beautiful woman work so closely with her husband? As the saying goes, even if you're not afraid of thieves, you should still be afraid of thieves thinking about you. Combined with what Rachel said previously, Lily's heart suddenly had a sense of uneasiness. Before she knew it, her husband Kevin, who used to follow her around all the time, had become arguably the most powerful figure in Chicago. As such, he had become highly sought after by everyone, including other women. "You said you want to leave me in charge of the Williams Company, right?" Lily asked. Her mind was currently a mess. "Of course, Lily. You're my wife. What's mine is yours, so I'm giving you the right to manage the Williams Company as well," Kevin answered naturally. "Actually, you don't have to be too nervous. After all, you won't have to bother concerning yourself with most company matters. Along with Miss Wilson, the managers of the various departments can handle things. You just need to make some of the bigger decisions and oversee the general picture." "Okay. As long as you're not afraid of bankruptcy, then leave the company to me," Lily accepted with a strange expression. Sandra soon came back with 2 cups of coffee. When she overheard Kevin's decision, although she was very surprised, she didn't dare to go against his wishes. After all, Kevin was the boss, so he could do whatever he wanted. In the next few days, Kevin was by Lily's side, following her around as she familiarized herself with the company's operations and procedures. At the same time, he also let everyone know that Lily was the new acting CEO. By now, it was almost winter. Kevin had paved the way for the Radiants to establish a branch in Chicago. On the surface, it was to further expand the Radiants' influence, but in reality, he did this to better protect Lily. Aside from this, Kevin spent some time setting up a protective barrier near the Salix Leaf complex. With this, anyone whose power base was below level 5 couldn't enter and exit the apartment without either his or Lily's permission. As for those above level 5, Kevin felt that he didn't need to worry about them. With that kind of strength, he believed that these experts would have enough pride, making it impossible for them to attack an ordinary woman. When all of this was done, Kevin sat in a chair and looked at the starry night sky. It wasn't easy to catch such a scene at this time of the year. Lily noticed that for the first time, Kevin appeared tired, and she expressed concern. "Kevin, you need to rest more. What can I do for you to help you?" "I'm not tired. I'm happy to have your back and to know that I can leave Williams Media in your hands while I'm away. And one of the many pluses of being an herbalist is that even if I were tired or sick, I could fix myself with a pill. You don't even need to worry about me." Kevin replied as he hoped that he had set Lily's worries to rest. Lily was indeed less concerned about Kevin's health. He wasn't ill, but relaxed. After a short conversation, the two of them fell into silence again. As the night wind blew between them and messed up Lily's long hair, no one took the initiative to speak, as if they were enjoying the rare peace while in each other's presence. "Oh, right, when are you going to leave again?" Lily suddenly opened her mouth and broke the silence. "Since matters in Chicago are almost settled, I'll probably leave the city tomorrow." Kevin turned around and held Lily's soft palm. "Don't get mad at me for leaving this time, okay?" Kevin understood that he owed Lily a lot. When the two of them first got married, he was like a stray dog that had to beg for scraps. And although he had managed to completely turn the tables now, he still had to face many opponents, so he felt that Lily didn't get to enjoy as good a life as his wife. "I understand the difficult position that you're in. Actually, I knew long ago that you didn't live an ordinary life. And while I'm aware that you have other matters and responsibilities to attend to, I'm not qualified to know about certain things at your level." Lily let Kevin hold her arm and slowly expressed what she thought in her heart. "But don't worry. I'll do my best to support you by managing the company. Besides, isn't Chicago your territory now? Nothing will happen to me with your people around." Kevin's lips curved up when she said this. No one knew what he was thinking. The night passed very quickly. When Kevin woke up very early the next morning, he looked lovingly at Lily, who was lying in bed beside him, and kissed her on the forehead with a thankful smile. Last night, the two of them had finally opened up their hearts to each other, completing the last step of Kevin's wish for them to reconcile as husband and wife. Before leaving, Kevin left a black credit card for Lily and sent the password to her phone. After putting on the clothes that Lily had prepared for him, Kevin looked at himself in the mirror and took a deep breath to compose himself. Dalton and Rachel had been waiting outside the door for a long time. Aside from them, the others who came by were also some of the most influential people in Chicago. What a pleasant surprise! Everyone is up early. Kevin greeted them with a smile. "We are all here to see President Williams off." Many influential figures replied in unison. "It seems that everyone wants me to leave the city so soon." Kevin couldn't help but smile and joke around. All the influential people simply smiled back and didn't say anything. While they didn't admit that what he said was true, they also didn't deny it either. But they all noted that Kevin seemed to know exactly what they were thinking and feeling, even if they pretended the opposite was true. Feeling threatened by Sandra Wilson, Lily stood her ground and accepted Kevin's offer to run the Williams Company. While helping her settle into the role over the next few days, Kevin also established the Radiance's branch in Chicago and set up a protective barrier around the Salix Leaf complex to keep her safe. Kevin felt as though the two of them had finally reconciled. When Kevin was about to leave for DC the next morning, he couldn't help but smile as he was greeted at his doorstep by Dalton and Rachel and other influential people who had come by to see him off. When he saw everyone, Kevin wasn't surprised that these people would all show up after finding out that he was leaving the city. After all, what he had done to those who didn't show their support was very clear to these people. As such, they had all come out here to mingle with him to get in his good graces. Given that these people had all been established figures in the city for decades, they knew very well what it would take for them to stay in power. "In my absence, I leave Chicago in your hands. Anyway, with the Prestige Club already established, I have paved the road for you guys." Kevin gradually shifted his gaze towards Emo Squire and the rest of his inner circle. He naturally didn't have the time to bother with those other brown-nosing people. "Don't worry, Kevin, it's just that Mitchell..." Rachel didn't finish her sentence. She knew that it was not the right time to discuss those things. But at the same time, if she missed this opportunity to bring it up, Mitchell Cook's fate would be a worry.
He's fine. It's just that you can't see him for the time being,
Dalton Steele reassured her. After all, he had taken over the responsibility of handling him personally for Kevin. Hearing all of this, Kevin didn't say anything. He turned around and took one last look inside the apartment. He didn't know when he would be back at the Salix Leaf Complex. At this time, Lily should still be sleeping, but Kevin figured that it would be better for him to leave this way, as he didn't want to make her sad when they parted ways. Just then, a black luxury car gradually stopped at the entrance of the Salix Leaf Complex. When Tyler Dawn got out of the car, everyone tactfully made way for him. "Take care, guys. Don't let my efforts go to waste." Kevin smiled and waved at everyone. His eyes then stayed on the second floor of the apartment for a few more seconds before he finally got into the car. However, no one noticed that a beautiful figure was leaning against the wall beside a window on the second floor. As Lily watched Kevin get into the car from their bedroom, she covered her mouth with her hands as tears flowed down her delicate face. No matter how hard she tried, she still couldn't hold herself back from crying. The truth was that Lily didn't want Kevin to leave this time, but she knew there were some aspects of his life that she couldn't control. In order to save time, Kevin chose to fly directly from Chicago to Washington, D.C. On the plane, Kevin lowered his head and looked at the black card in his hand. He then squinted his eyes as he felt the patterns that were engraved on the card. This was the qualification card that the Herbalist Society had sent to him a long time ago. The pill-gathering battle and herbalist competition that occurred once every few years was about to begin in Washington, D.C. This was also one of the reasons why Kevin wanted to settle all his matters in Chicago as soon as possible. "Excuse me, are you an herbalist?" An unfamiliar and clear voice suddenly sounded. Only then did Kevin regain his senses. When he looked up, he saw a woman who was about the same age as him, blinking her big, sparkling eyes at him. "You know what this card is for?" Kevin held the card between his index and middle fingers, looking at the woman sitting beside him with sudden interest. The Herbalist Society's unique qualifications card wasn't something that ordinary people would recognize. Given this, the woman's words were enough to prove that she had a mysterious identity. "Of course, in D.C., I am the..." The woman suddenly stopped mid-sentence and vigilantly glanced at Kevin. "Wait a minute. Are you really an herbalist? Why do I feel that you don't seem to look like one?" "Is that so? Tell me, in what aspect don't I look like one?" A few black lines appeared on Kevin's forehead as his brows furrowed. "Aren't herbalists all big shots who dress and act like it? But your appearance..." The woman didn't feel the need to explain herself any further as her tone immediately changed and she said, "You most likely just picked that card up from somewhere, right? It's not that I'm looking down on you, but if you know what's good for you, it's best not to provoke herbalists." The woman continued, "Besides, the upcoming herbalist competition is very important. If you're merely hoping to gain experience, there's no need to fake it. Just apply to one of the herbalist schools like everyone else and study hard. But in the meantime, it's better to return that card to the Herbalist Society. After all, being an herbalist isn't something that can be decided by just a card. If you join the herbalist competition blindly, and the others see that you don't understand what you're doing, you'll only make a fool out of yourself in public. Furthermore, each card corresponds to a single herbalist. So if the Herbalist Society were to find out the truth in the matter, I'm afraid that you would face heavy punishment." The more the woman spoke, the more riled up she became. Her words were like a never-ending lecture from a teacher who was trying to persuade a student who couldn't be taught no matter how hard she tried. Her condescending words made the corners of Kevin's mouth twitch, but whenever he wanted to refute something, he couldn't seem to find the right words to express it. Then what do you think I should do?" Kevin asked this subconsciously, but the moment these words came out of his mouth, he instantly regretted it. He didn't think that their conversation would take such an unexpected turn. "So, you really just picked it up, right? As I said, you don't look like an herbalist. Lucky for you, we crossed paths by chance. Now give me that card. I have a friend in the organization who can trace it back to its rightful owner. Perhaps, if you can return the card to the herbalist who lost it, Maybe they'll even reward you with a few pills if they're feeling generous." The woman raised her head proudly as if having a friend in the Herbalist Society was an amazing thing. "Should I thank you for your kind offer?" Kevin asked, not knowing whether to laugh or cry. "No need to thank me. Doing good deeds is more than enough for me." The woman waved her hand indifferently, but a strange light flashed in the depths of her eyes. "All right. Anyway, there's still some time before we land in D.C. I'm going to get some rest." Kevin took a deep breath and ignored the woman as he closed his eyes to try to fall asleep. "Hey, why are you like this?" The woman suddenly became unhappy. She puffed up her cheeks and said with a frown, "Can't you see that I'm doing this for your own good? How dare you not appreciate it? If I wasn't kind-hearted enough to help a stranger like you, do you think that someone else would take care of this matter for you?" "Miss, there's no need to get angry. Since you said to yourself that I'm nothing but a stranger, then just don't think about me anymore and move on with your life. It's as simple as that." Kevin responded without even opening his eyes. It's up to you. Let's see if you can still dare to be so arrogant when we get there." The woman crossed her arms in front of her chest and turned her head away, no longer looking at Kevin. The short conversation between the two temporarily ended. No one paid any attention to each other. Kevin's eyes were tightly closed as if he had really fallen asleep. The woman, on the other hand, kept rolling her eyes. No one knew what she was thinking about, but her eyes kept scanning Kevin. Almost 2 hours later, the plane finally descended from the air and landed steadily at the airport in Washington, D.C. Kevin was about to get up from his seat when he was suddenly stopped by the woman. "Hey, are you sure that you really don't want to give it to me?" she asked. "You don't have to worry about it. The Herbalist Society won't do anything to me," Kevin answered her with confidence. He didn't even turn his head to respond. "Why are you being so stubborn? Don't you appreciate the fact that I'm trying to help you?" The woman's tone became colder and colder, and the intensity of her voice also increased by several levels. This caused the surrounding passengers who were making their way up to the first-class cabin to get off the plane look at her in shock. "Thank you for your good intentions, but I really don't need you to worry about me." Kevin turned his head slightly and smiled politely at her. "Okay, if you say so. You better not regret it later." The woman let out a cold snort and brushed past Kevin with force as she quickly got off the plane. Kevin only shrugged his shoulders and shook his head at this. After all, he had encountered these kinds of words of caution many times. In fact, he had heard it at least 100 times, and it was as if he had already developed calluses in his ears because of this. But despite all the warnings that he had received over the years, he was still alive and well. Moreover, his days were only getting better and better. When he got off the plane, he saw that the airport felt twice as busy as the one in Chicago. It was enough to prove that Washington, D.C. was a city with much more power and influence on the national stage. As the bustling people flowed into and out of the airport, Kevin was thinking about how to proceed to the next step of his plan when a dozen or so people in black suits quickly approached him. The one in the lead was the same woman who was on the plane earlier. Don't blame me for being ruthless this time around. I already gave you a few chances to do the right thing on the plane. When will you realize that what's not yours to begin with isn't necessarily destined to be yours if you pick it up? So if you know what's good for you, hand the card over or else." The woman crossed her arms in front of her chest and raised her head proudly as she looked at Kevin disdainfully. "There is one thing that I'm quite curious about. Why are you so obsessed with the card in my hand? Are you really planning to return it to its rightful owner, or do you have other hidden motives for wanting to take it?" Kevin's anger slightly swept across the dozen or so people in black suits, only to be very shocked at what he saw. If he didn't give them a good look, he wouldn't have realized that the dozen or so people were all level 5 experts. These days, it seemed that level 5 experts could easily be encountered just about anywhere. Was it really easy to become that powerful now? There's nothing that I've set my eyes on that I can't obtain," the woman retorted in a cruel and unreasonable manner. "Since you don't look like you're from around here, I'll give you 2 choices today.
so you can't say that I'm just doing this to bully outsiders. First, you can give me what I want, then apologize for insulting me on the plane. Otherwise, if you're unwilling to cooperate, your other option is for me to get someone to break your legs and drive you out of D.C. today." As soon as she finished talking, the dozen or so people in black suits behind the woman quickly walked up in front of her. Kevin could feel the killing intent in their eyes even beneath their sunglasses. "Is there a third option?" Kevin smiled as he looked at the people around him. "Actually, there is," the woman nodded slightly. "But the third one means that you don't know how to appreciate my kindness. As such, your life will end right here." As soon as these words came out, all of the people in black suits suddenly surrounded Kevin, leaning over him like a bunch of bullies. Kevin frowned slightly. Even before flying here, he had already expected that it would be much more difficult to deal with things like this in Washington, D.C. This was because he knew that the majority of those in power here were cold and calculating people. Therefore, Kevin had never thought of acting like the powerful CEO from Chicago that he was, but at the same time, he wouldn't allow himself to be bullied by any locals. After all, he could become a giant anywhere if he wanted to. And even if he was currently unprepared and in an unfamiliar environment, how could he let these people step on him like a piece of dirt? Just then, a burst of rapid footsteps could be heard, as 5 or 6 young men rushed over and pushed the woman's subordinates away without any hesitation. "Excuse me, are you Mr. Kevin Williams? I was sent here by Mr. Herman Thompson to pick you up." The man in the lead was about 20 years old. He was dressed in plain clothes and spoke with a smile. However, Kevin glanced at him and the others. Although these people came a little suddenly, what did it mean if those level 5 experts were pushed away so easily by these people? Kevin knew he would have to learn a lot about how power worked in Washington